All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the January 3rd, 2024 meeting of SIG-Auth. Happy New Year, and let's get started. Let me quickly share my screen. Can y'all see?
Yep.
All right.
Yes.
All right, announcements. Jordan?
I just want to let people know the proposed enhancements freeze date for 1:30 is February 8th, so about a month. So anything that people are wanting to do in 1:30, needs to have designs finalized by then. I have an agenda item later, which is a link to our sort of ongoing planning doc where look at stuff in progress and stuff in the backlog. But just to give people a timeline for that, if there's a new thing that's not yet implementable, stuff that's like promoting to beta is probably easier to sort of look at any adjustments that need to be made, PRR stuff, graduation requirements. But if there's new stuff, we really probably want it ready for review in the next week or two, so that we have time for reviews and updates to get it implementable by then.
Cool. Next one we have reference grant update.
Yeah, I don't actually know who added it, but I was going to add it somewhere in the agenda. But this was not added by me, but I did a lot of the work related to this, so I can talk about it.
Yeah, I threw it in there. I mostly I just wanted to let people know it was there, but so I didn't expect to spend a lot of time on it here, but I wanted to signal boost it. So yeah, go for it, Rob.
Yeah, just high level. One of the caps that has kind of gotten stuck is the idea of taking reference grant from Gateway API to SIG-Auth. We had some discussions at previous KubeCons about how we could move this forward, and that those roughly resulted in this doc, which has recently over the holidays transitioned into a POC to even see if it was viable. There are a couple changes between this doc and the POC, just like, for example, API version needed to fit in. A few little things that just needed to exist to make it work. I'll try and backport them back to this doc itself. But yeah, looking for help, assistance, feedback, etc. The POC is technically somewhat working, but it's rough. So this is really our attempt at trying to push this forward so it has a viable path to alpha in 1:30. That's it.
Just a quick skim. I noticed that there's a bit where a controller is creating RBAC. Did you decide to go that route as opposed to creating a new kind of authorizer directly?
Oh yeah.
Is there a discussion of the trade-off between the two?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So this is something that's an implementation detail. That's what I'd say. Like it could be either when we actually get to a real implementation, but the easiest thing in terms of a POC was to just generate RBAC. But generated RBAC is basically the same thing as saying an authorizer could do this, is my opinion anyways.
I guess I'd want to have that nailed down for alpha, because I do believe that any perceivable piece of behavior will be treated as guaranteed API surface. So I think that's important to get right for alpha.
Yeah.
But great, yeah.
I had actually suggested this approach because it lets you do it as it separates your phases. One phase is gathering the stuff you want to authorize, and then the second phase is actuating the authorization. And rendering out to RBAC lets you backfill onto older clusters and run it purely externally. Obviously, it'd be more performant if you could authorize it directly. So if we did similar things with like pod security policy, where we had the logic as a admission plugin that could be run in process or as a webhook, I would see rendering to RBAC or authorizing in process as a similar possibility.
I think reasoning through whether we think people will look and say, is the RBAC created? Can I manipulate the RBAC? Can I inspect the RBAC? Can I invert the checks? I think reasoning through the client implications are important, because I can definitely picture people saying, ah, it has RBAC, therefore I know who has access, therefore I can, inspect backwards, versus in order to know who has access to this, I must inspect another resource. And so
Yeah.
I would see that as extremely likely for people to build, and for us to make an affirmative decision one way or another. But I don't think I think replacing would end up fraught based on likely uses.
I'm not sure what you mean by replacing. I would expect the entry version to not render to RBAC and authorize directly, but for it to be able to be run against an older cluster externally and do RBAC if you wanted. But
I guess to be discussed on the cap. I could, if the entry version never had the RBAC, I could see that you might be able to switch. But if entry ever produced RBAC, then I think you're going to end up in a state where extensions built on top of it that try to reason about it are going to have an explicit dependency on having that RBAC created. And I'm not confident that's what we want.
okay. To be, I guess we can talk about this more when we get to the 130 plans, but Rob, I think you're looking for one or more people on the SIG-Auth side to help drive this. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Especially when it comes to writing what could be a new authorizer, that's not something I have much experience with. I can roughly write a controller, but I'm pretty rusty there. So if you look at the proof of concept, it's pretty rough. So any help, any feedback. I think the next thing I'm going to work on is an update to the KEP itself, so that we can discuss some of the details like David mentioned there about whether this is an authorizer. But yeah, even any feedback, whether it's on the doc, on the repo, or find me on Slack if you're interested in helping push this forward.
Okay, David, can I put you down as an interested reviewer on this as well?
Sure.
Okay. And it'd probably be good to note that implementation help is needed as well. So I think Rob and Nick were there, but if the line above interested parties, we probably want to indicate like needs hands to drive this. All right, cool. Thank you. I'm always excited to see a proof of concept. Like working code is a lot easier to sort of understand the user experience of. And yeah, hopefully it was helpful to put together.
Right. Next we have, I don't think Mo's here. Should we skip or?
I'd rather talk about it when
Okay.
Mo's here.
Alrighty. I just didn't know if we all had the context. Consider.
Yeah, let's wait for Mo.
Sorry, what?
But let's wait for Mo on this one.
Yeah.
I'm not sure who added the security audit items. If I recall correctly, previous attempt at this got stuck around whether or not the authentication mechanism should be just an annotation, like a freeform annotation, or if audit events should have more structured fields for. Yeah, exactly. That was where I remember the previous one stalling out. I hadn't thought about it much since Tim's comment. But I agree that that's probably the thing to figure out before we expand use of that. This isn't super high on my priority list, but if someone cared about this a lot and wanted to try to work through that question, that would be fine. I don't know, what do other people think?
I don't have an opinion on this particular one. Tim's comment's a good one.
Okay.
I would not like to see it added to request attributes though. So internally, I don't want to have the authenticator name itself usable inside of our authorization chain.
Yeah, there's a set of stuff that only gets put into audit events.
I know. I just want to be sure like we're agreed on that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we have to solve this for all the existing audit annotations, but I think going forward, I'd like to see this not just piled onto the annotations.
So it sounds like this might need a cap, like a discuss next steps as opposed to continuing on this PR, is that right? Maybe we can add this to this doc. If we think it's a,
It's a small cap, if there is such a thing. Yeah.
A new API or a different API there would end up needing documentation somewhere. I don't feel strongly, but either way, Tim, are you interested in carrying it forward this release or no?
I am not interested in picking this up. I'd be happy to be a reviewer on it, but I don't think I can drive this.
Maybe move for the next release anyway.
I think we should at least summarize there. So I think we have 2 PRs open. Were both PRs still open? We should at least summarize what they're blocked on and what the next step for moving it forward is. It sounds like a dedicated field in audit event for holding this information is what we're all agreeing on. The shape of that I think probably does need a cap, and how it interacts with some of the delegated authentication methods. Like if you use a token webhook and it goes off somewhere, does that thing have the ability to answer back, like which token authenticator was used? Like so we have chained authentication mechanisms, and it's not clear how that would work with this. So I think what this was doing was just saying like token and losing all visibility to if the token webhook you called out to had a like which token authenticator. So those are questions that we would want to answer.
Okay. Maybe I'll come back to this issue and add needs PEP. I guess.
I'm happy to summarize what I just said in a comment on
Okay,
as
great.
well.
This is actually the right issue, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see.
What do you think about this one, David?
So how, I mean, I guess I know some kind of a sniffer could find it locally, but I don't feel strongly because like it's really hard. It's basically impossible for someone to accidentally be doing this.
Yeah.
So I don't mind adding the restriction. I also don't see it as super important. But
I'm not sure we have the plumbing to do that restriction, actually.
oh yeah, yeah, we don't see the IP address. We could,
That's the issue, like 2 bullets down in the discussion agenda.
different spot. That's for admission, right? So authentication would be in a different spot.
Right. Could this be used as a kind of a persistence mechanism? Like if you manage to compromise a master VM, grab the token, and now you have unlimited access to the cluster from remotely.
So just to grab it, we are talking about someone taking the TLS certs on the master, I guess.
Or not certs. It's like inspect memory. It's held in memory.
It's held in memory. So you're saying directly inspect the memory, not set up a packet sniffer from an intercept. Okay. Wow. And once you get to the point of being able to inspect the memory,
you can also get signing keys for service account tokens.
You could also just get the etcd direct credentials, and you must already be on that host. So
yeah, I don't think the exploit is particularly compelling. I think this is more just saying, why do we have a credential that's expected to only be used locally, which is actually usable remotely? Which in the abstract, I would prefer it not be usable remotely.
Or why even have a credential for this path at all? Like use a Unix socket or something.
We don't listen on a Unix socket. We like it unifies a lot of code paths.
a Unix socket would also be externally visible, versus someone download the memory of the program.
Yeah, like a Unix socket would be writable by anyone root on the machine.
Yeah, but with a Unix socket, like the API server can see who is connecting the Unix username and make sure it's itself, right? It just seems weird to have, we have this backdoor interface. So the solution is we generate a token in memory and only accept that token. That's a little
it made the
strange.
I mean, implementation wise, that code path was very easy to build.
Sure.
And it is pretty difficult to exploit.
I think the benefit of that is that we are confident that everything we do for the handling, so panic recovery and timeout and admission and everything, works consistently. As soon as you are building a separate handler chain, a separate handler chain, I think, is actually harder to reason about and would not behave consistently, which is why we did it this way.
I thinking about it, if we don't have the IP, and you're right, we don't have it there, I would just leave it.
You can embed the IP in the token itself. It's like,
But that makes it equivalent then, right? Because right now we don't expose to authenticators the IP address the request came from.
fair enough. I
I'm
mean,
not sure as an authenticator has.
can we switch this to use MTLS?
I don't see how that would be better. You would have a certificate generated in memory, and you have exactly the same exposure. Like by the time, I guess, from my perspective, once you get to the point of I pulled the memory for the process, everything that you wanted to protect is already exposed. So I don't see much value in making a change.
Yeah, like literally you have a signing key for service account tokens. So it can go make service account tokens and use them. And the way you would get rid of that is by rotating your tokens. The way you get rid of this token is by restarting the Cube API server. Like, if you know you've been compromised, you probably need to burn the cluster. But if you want to, you could restart the Cube API server and that token is no longer valid. So it's trivial to remove access someone has, assuming they haven't used that to gain other access, which they probably would. I don't know. To me, this is low priority given what else someone who had access to exfiltrate this token would have access to.
Fair enough.
If someone wanted to go do the work to make the privileged token authenticator, I guess instead of having it be a bearer token authenticator, it could be a request authenticator where it would have the IP address. I wouldn't necessarily object, but it's low priority in my view.
Clever solution. Hadn't thought of that. Yeah, I agree. Not particularly important, given what else you have there.
All right. I can add that information to the issue and say
Yeah.
in today's.
I was gonna say, good to persist that in the issue itself. Cool. Let's let's look at the next one. Aren't these fun?
I
could
thought
be going as far as a warning, but I don't think I would. I don't think I have appetite for breaking clusters that only have one.
if they only have one and they're not using request header allowed names, doesn't that seem really, really bad?
I think there's a default value, isn't there?
For request header allowed names?
Is there not?
No. How would we know what
Oh,
to do?
yeah. Bad, but
I guess it's like equivalent to the always allow authenticator, right?
yeah.
There's also one goofy thing about this, which is that because Kube API server uses the aggregated API libraries, there's like, you can't even have request header client CA file configured on Kube API server. So it sets the config map and not have it Kube API server actually accept delegated authorization via the mechanism. There's no distinction between those two modes. Does that make sense?
Say that again.
So you need to configure request header client CA file on Kube API server to populate the config map. That is the same flag that is used by extension API servers to read the file and then accept enable the request header authenticator. So there's no way for Kube API server to populate that config map and but not enable the request header authenticator for itself, which I think is kind of goofy.
Because the front proxy was made to be consistent everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think like a lot of people do not even want request header authenticator to be running on their Kube API server, but it is basically everywhere, which I think is a little bit of an aside, but
Yeah, I'd be open to a change for that. Actually, I hadn't really thought of it.
and yeah, for this, I would also be, it seems like if the default is allow everything, we should break the command line API. I don't really see a reason why you would want, you would need to allow any name for the request header CA. I think the very most common use case is like you have one kind of distinguished name that you always expect, and you have a very locked down CA.
But we would still allow the same one to be used for client CA file and request header, or request header client CA, correct?
Yeah, I mean that's a third option for hardening this.
I mean, it's definitely one I've encouraged everyone, like separate CAs, but I anticipate many people not doing that.
Having the same one,
yeah,
as long as you identify the specific names that are your front proxy,
okay,
doesn't seem like something we should break.
Okay, good. As long as we aren't breaking that, then I don't mind requiring a request header allowed to be specified. Allowed names.
So if they overlap and they don't, if they overlap, we require request header allowed names. That's what we're saying.
Yeah, that would work.
That seems like the only people it will impact are people who are broken in ways they almost certainly don't intend.
I look forward to future bug reports.
We have saved you. You're welcome. Yeah. Okay. We should ask people to put their names by their agenda items because I don't know who added these things.
For this one, I find the discussion points from last time still valid.
So I linked to these. It was almost exactly 1 year ago, which amused me. So this was Mike's. Sorry, I should have linked to the particular item. Keep going. Keep going. No, did I miss it? Yeah, well, okay. So Mike had opened a proposal to add, I think it was just IP information into token review. I think token review is the main one, but there was also discussion about subject access review and admission review. And actually, one of the motivations was that some credentials should only be usable from some network locations. But the questions that came up last time were whether Kube API server had trustworthy and consistent visibility to the request IP, which it may or may not, depending on the network topology of the Kube API server. So that was one concern specifically about IP, especially if we're going to start propagating that IP out to, different token review, subject access review, admission review. At that point, the data becomes part of the API, and so if people are going to integrate with it, seems like they need to be able to do it consistently. Maybe we could make the case that, like, your webhook token webhooks are specific to your cluster. So your network topology, so what data is going to be put in there and how trustworthy it is. But it was not clear that we had good data to put in that field.
I think it's down to the implementer, right? If you in your distro want to layer a front proxy in front of Kube API server, it's your responsibility to make sure that you pass the underlying client IP in a header or something, assuming that we can do that.
Yeah. If we just take the remote address from the request as is, which is, I guess, what we would do, it wasn't obvious that is trustworthy automatically. So it might need to be an opt-in thing so that by default, Kube API server doesn't populate that field. And if you run your Kube API server in a trustworthy way and it can use that address, then you could tell it to pass it. I don't know.
We had the same issue with IP and audit logs a while ago too. Yeah, I think that the indication that a Kube API server is frontline should need to be explicit to do, you know, the additional sanitization of that of the input. And even if it is not a frontline Kube API server, but it accepts, you know, traffic from, you know, multiple sources, it needs to have, you know, this is a trusted proxy to be forwarding this information, a lot like we have with request header authenticator. Maybe, you know, if we want to have X forwarded for be accepted as truth, it should come from a client that presented a request header authenticator certificate or something like that.
Yeah. I don't know that those are insurmountable, but they were not obvious and trivial.
Definitely
Both
not trivial.
in how Kube API server figures it out and how it represents that information to the reviews. It's not just a single string field, possibly, because then you get into like chains of like forwarded for. Here's the chain of proxies that led here and how trustworthy each step of that is. That was all about just the IP address. As soon as you start talking about like copying request information into review APIs, everybody and their brothers show up wanting like just one more piece of request information. Like, oh, but I also want this random header, or I also want to know like what, you know, was this HTTP 1 or HTTP 2, or what TLS version was this? Like, it felt like opening a can of worms. And it would be good to have clear principles for like what parts of the request do we surface and how do we keep from growing without bound, and how does that interact with things like especially once you get beyond token authentication into stuff like authorization, how does that interact with delegated authorization checks from things like kubelet or aggregated API servers? Not necessarily insurmountable, but non-obvious. And the last time we talked about this, it kind of stalled out around those things.
Yeah, I think with a front proxy, people are able to work around this by appending lots of garbage to the authorization bearer header. Yet that works to get to the you know, pass additional context to the authenticator. However, to continue to pass that forward, you need to use user info, which also expands, I guess, extra info, which also expands the surface far beyond authorization, because it shows up in, you know, admission checks, it shows up in certificate signing requests, it shows up in logs, and, you know, even if you encrypt it, it's just a bunch of trash that we're copying around everywhere. So not the end of the world, but definitely the situation is not the workaround is not ideal, even with, you know, somebody willing to build an auth proxy.
So those are the points that we discussed last time. I don't know if anyone is motivated to try to resolve those questions, but that's the current state of the world.
You want to add this to the issue as well?
Sure. Summarizer in chief, I think, is my my role for today.
let's talk about this one. Okay.
Yeah. So I think Jordan is right. The silently treating the request as unauthenticated is me being confused about the behavior. We have some non-optimal behavior in our webhook backend. So the main problem, so basically to give some context, we had an issue where for various stupid reasons, some Googlers are in like 5,000 individual groups that get forwarded back to the, from the authentication webhook. And collecting all those groups was taking so long that we were timing out, hitting whatever timeout is inside KubeAPI server, whether that's 10 seconds, 30 seconds, I'm not sure. So those requests were failing with unauthenticated. So I guess there's two parts to it. One would be like, should we make that timeout configurable? As far as I can tell, it is not. It's like wired up maybe to be, it's like halfway wired up to be configurable, but not actually surfaced in a flag. Or as Mo says, in the shiny new authentication config. The other is like, has there been any thought about, is there a better way to access groups from RBAC rather than getting a list of 5,000 groups returned in one webhook response?
Configurable timeout seems like a good idea. We did this with the structured authorization config in 129. So in 129, if you configure your webhook authorizer in the config file, there's a timeout field. You can change that from the default. So I think the structured authentication config file today only has stuff for the OIDC authenticator, but we intentionally designed it in a way that we could add in webhook token authenticators as well and transition from flags to config if we wanted to be more expressive. So
Okay.
that seems like a pretty well-paved possibility for letting you do a token authenticator in the config file and getting extra expressibility for things like timeout.
And if someone from our team wanted to take that up, we need a cap for that, right?
We might be able to do an extension of the existing structured authentication cap.
Okay.
Yeah, either an extension of that or like a one-off follow-up says, and now it stands up for this, but it's pretty well paved.
Okay.
The making groups implicit rather than explicit. We talked about this a long time ago, like 9 years ago, something like that. And the difficulty with that is making our authentication and authorization systems composable. So today, authentication is just one layer, and all the information that comes back from authentication is available to all of the authorizers that you have. And so if you start making group membership either implicitly known to the authorizer or another action that the authorizer has to go perform out of band, you then have to teach every authorization implementation about that. So RBAC and IAM and whatever other authorization integrations you have. That's teaching multiple authorizers how to go fetch the same group information for a user didn't seem like a good idea, especially if one of those was going to have to be like the RBAC authorizer that's built into KubeAPI server. Yeah, that's why that never really went anywhere. It's entirely in bounds for an external system that knows both about authentication and authorization to not include all of its group memberships for a user if it doesn't care if other authorizers or audit have access to that information, and to just do the user to group expansion on its own when its authorizer is called. Like that's in bounds if it wants to do that.
Yeah, that's what we do for like IAM
Yeah.
in Google. But I think in the specific context of this feature, it is actually surfacing IAM groups into RBAC.
Yeah. You can't have it both ways, I guess. If you want your groups to be usable by any random authorizer, then what we have today is the authentication layer has to return them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we could come up with a interface for authorizers to request groups or hint groups back to the authenticator, like, is that something that
You say
if we can find a good way to do it?
Authenticator?
Yeah. Authentication first, authorization second. A way for authorizers to resolve groups.
Yeah, well, from the authenticator that was chosen, or you set some extra flag that says groups not included, but you can use the new interface to ask me about specific groups, or because I think the unless you're in a significantly pathological case, like RBAC is only interested in a few groups once it knows the principal, because RBAC can tell which groups have been wait, not even once it knows the principal. Once it knows what is trying to be done, RBAC should yield you a few groups that are candidates.
I think the evaluation is actually the opposite of what you're thinking today, just because we have the group information. So
Well,
Okay.
It could be done in the way he's describing, but
yeah,
I don't. That composability of the system is very easy to reason about.
yeah, sort of the reversing that flow also does squirrely things with stuff like certificate requests, where we record the information about who made the certificate request so that it can be authorized later. I guess if you could go from user, I don't know. I
think it would have to be a sort of a 3-phase thing with, like, first you do authentication that has the opportunity to set the main principal, then you go to authorization, and then authorization can call back to authentication.
Or
But I'd
could
have
we just way to configure a timeout and tell people we don't recommend having 5,000 groups?
Yeah. I mean, it actually becomes, I think, a different type of request. So first you get identity, then you authorize, and authorization becomes conditional. So you say it's authorized if they're a member of these groups, and then it's another call to say, is this identity a member of these groups? So it's a new type of integration, and one that I'm not eager to go try to teach a bunch of different authorizers about. Yeah, I don't know. I did want to get to the KMS. I think we'll punt the 130 plans doc to next time, just because we don't have time to go through that. But I did want to at least surface that, so people should start looking through that and thinking about what they're going to work on. But I did want to get to the KMS V1 item.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Rita.
Yeah, so the KEP currently mentions when V2 API is GA that obviously will disable it by default, right? In release N, and then stop supporting writes N+3, and then remove it at N+6.
Yeah, the disable by default happens. Like, we have a feature gate that is
Yes.
default off now. So if you want to use the V1, KMS V1, you have to opt back into this deprecated feature gate, which is fine. Like that tells people, it made them take action to keep using V1 and told them that V2 is available. So that's already happened.
Mhm.
I am not in favor of removing it completely. For multiple, unless it becomes so overwhelmingly burdensome to maintain, which I don't actually think just leaving the code there as a reader will be burdensome to maintain at all. We don't have a good storage migration story today, and I don't think it's a good idea to drop the ability of to use the V1 to read data. So I would strike remove at release n+6 from that. I didn't actually remember that was in the cap.
Gotcha. What about this one?
I'm on the fence there. I would like to understand our motivation here. Again, I don't think we're actually saving ourselves maintenance. Like I don't think the KMS V1 integration takes any maintenance from us. We're just going to let the code sit there and work as it's always worked. We've already said we're not going to fix performance issues with it. You know, the performance issues are fixed by KMS V2. If we're trying to motivate people who are currently using V1 to switch to V2, I think anyone using V1 in a serious way is already motivated to switch to V2 because V1 is so bad. Like I don't think we need to just make people's lives harder to motivate them to switch to V2.
So, hi, this is Ming. I want to ask, is there any tool like a controller that can be used to help? Because there might be some cases that one cluster owns some hundreds of thousands secrets. Is there any good practice to help the migration? Because definitely there's a pen for the KMS V1, and if there's another pen for the migration, then probably the user will hesitate, oh, which pen do I choose? Does that make sense?
Which what do we choose?
Which
I mean,
pen?
yeah, which pen? There's a pen for KMS V1, and if the migration also is pen, because there are clusters holding hundreds of thousands of secrets. How can we? Yeah.
The migration looks the same as a KMS key rotation.
Is there any controller or any practice that can help?
The storage migrator controller will rotate an object. An encrypted object can also be migrated in storage by doing no-op writes. If a no-op write of every instance is done. So the storage migration controller is the one the project has, but any writer could trigger the migration. David has a hand. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you had described your I don't want to destroy reads in n+6 based on lack of migrator. If the migrator moves in, does that change your opinion on removing for reads? In other words, you use as a reason. Is it truly a reason, or is the reason it doesn't cause much trouble? I just want to keep it.
I would say storage migrator is necessary, but not sufficient because it also requires config changes on.
Okay, that's good to describe that. So it's not. It is. This is never be a zero config change to allow this. It is effectively keep it as read forever because it doesn't cost much, and we don't want people to have to reconfigure a cluster.
Yeah, that's my take. If I don't think the motivating people to switch to V2 is a good reason to remove it. If it became prohibitively problematic to maintain, then we could think about it. I don't know. What do other people think?
I think that the less code we have, the better shape we will be in 5 years from now. I can certainly understand not wanting to remove the path until there is a storage version migrator that's built in. That's already on our path forward. That sounds fine. The point at which writes will no longer be supported is actually the point where you're forcing that configuration change. And so,
Right.
given your reasoning, you're also not in favor of stopping writes. I do find myself in favor of a stick of some kind to reduce the overall code base at nebulous point in the future, at specific point in the future that we will choose. So having a condition of storage version migrator must be available, must be able to do this in some automatic way after a configuration change, all sounds reasonable. But I think we should be open to specifying some time for that.
Yeah, every time we put a must change config obstacle in people's path for upgrade, we see clusters get stuck on that version. And it would not seem like a win to me to drop the KMSV1 package and not have to think about it anymore, which I don't think we really think about it now, and then have a percent of clusters get stuck for that reason. That I wouldn't be happy we had done that and seeing part of the ecosystem get stuck on a version upgrade.
For the sake of time, would it be better if we update the cap to say, upon, when we have the storage migrator, then we can come back to this decision? Because right now it does kind of say n+3, n+6,
Yeah.
which is
I think-
daunting. I get that.
I think a good step would be to outline the actual reasons for the choice, which appear to be never want to remove because it makes a user change configuration and that causes them to not want to upgrade. And being explicit about the actual reason.
And the maintenance cost is negligible as far as we can tell.
The maintenance cost for us. So project yourself 5 years from now. Someone else will have it. Hopefully.
I mean, it hasn't changed in the last 5 years, and we already said we're not going to address performance issues. Like, I don't know. But yes, we should update the cap to not say things we don't currently agree that we're going to do, and we should describe what we've discussed here. I'm summarizing a lot of other things. Can you update that one, Rita?
Yeah,
Thanks.
so that you don't have to be the summarizer, chief summarizer. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I sort of think, like, at the very least, like, nothing, like, we could have this same discussion 5 years from now if it's actually a burden, right?
I mean, if it's actually a burden, we can have the discussion sooner.
Right. So it seems like the safe default is to say, like, we don't plan to remove this, but if we do in the future, like, we'll discuss it carefully and have a long enough timeline that people can migrate, and we'll make sure it's possible to migrate, right? But like, we know it's possible to migrate today. Like, we designed it for migration.
I just
and
want
yeah, I mean,
listed and accurate, because the first reasons listed aren't consistent with the approach. So
Yeah, 100% agree with like the kept updating the kept.
it's not like I want to eliminate reads. It's I don't want to do reads or writes. And the reason is I don't want to make it harder to upgrade. Not there is a lack of tool X that already exists. We just need to bring it in.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Yeah, can we update the cap to describe that why we want to, and also explain that we don't want to remove the KMSV1. And if in future we want to remove KMSV1, then we will give sufficient long time considering the migration.
Okay, yep, I'll push a PR and then y'all can give feedback in that PR. Sounds good? Okay, well, that concludes today's SIG-Auth call. Thanks, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Bye.